It was 1:43 a.m. when Marcus Chen realized the music had stopped, but the party was still going. He was standing in the kitchen of the old Victorian house on Ashwood Street, holding a plastic cup of beer that had gone warm in his hand, watching people move through the rooms with their masks still on, laughing, dancing, talking, but he couldn't hear any of it. The silence was complete and wrong, like someone had pressed mute on reality itself. He could see their mouths moving, see their bodies swaying to music that wasn't playing, and when he tried to speak, to ask if anyone else noticed, no sound came out. His voice had been swallowed by the same silence that had eaten everything else. Marcus had come to the party with his girlfriend Jen and 3 friends from their graduate program at the university. It was October 31st, 2021, and they were all too old for trick-or-treating but too young to stop celebrating Halloween entirely. The house belonged to someone's cousin's friend. Marcus had already forgotten the exact connection, and the invitation had promised the best Halloween party of the year in an old mansion that was supposedly haunted. They'd laughed about that, the way people in their mid-20s laugh about ghost stories, with just enough irony to protect themselves from looking foolish if they admitted they were actually a little unnerved. The house certainly looked the part. 3 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture, complete with a turret, wrap-around porch, and stained glass windows that glowed like eyes in the dark. It sat at the end of a dead-end street in the historic district, surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches scraped against the upper windows when the wind picked up. Marcus had felt a flutter of unease when they'd first approached, but Jen had squeezed his hand and pulled him forward, and the unease had dissolved in the warmth of her touch and the sound of music thumping from inside. The party had been everything promised. At least 100 people packed into the house, all in elaborate costumes, the air thick with artificial fog and the smell of dry ice and spilled alcohol. Someone had set up a sound system that must have cost thousands of dollars, the bass so powerful Marcus could feel it in his chest like a second heartbeat. Strobe lights flashed in time with the music. Carved pumpkins lined every surface, their flickering candles creating moving shadows on the walls. It was chaotic and loud and exactly the kind of controlled mayhem that made Halloween parties feel transgressive and exciting. They'd arrived around 10 p.m., fashionably late, and had immediately split up to explore. Jen wanted to find the bar. Their friend David wanted to see the supposedly haunted 3rd floor. Sarah was looking for the bathroom, and Josh had spotted someone he knew from undergrad. Marcus had drifted into the kitchen, thinking he'd grab a drink and then go find Jen, but the kitchen was packed with people and he'd gotten caught in a conversation with a woman in a plague doctor mask about whether the house was really haunted or if that was just marketing. "Oh, it's haunted," the woman had said, her voice muffled behind the leather mask with its long, curved beak. 3 people died here in 1987, murder-suicide. The father lost his job, couldn't handle the stress, killed his wife and daughter and then himself. They found him hanging in the turret room upstairs. Marcus had made the appropriate noises of interest, though he'd heard a dozen variations of this story at a dozen different parties. Every old house had a tragic history if you looked hard enough. Every building held ghosts if you were willing to believe in them. "You don't believe me?" the plague doctor woman had said, tilting her head in a distinctly bird-like gesture. "That's fine. You will." She'd walked away before Marcus could respond, disappearing into the crowd with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, there 1 second and gone the next. He'd shrugged it off and gone to find Jen, who was in the living room dancing with Sarah, both of them flushed and laughing, their movements loose and unself-conscious in the way that suggested they'd already had a few drinks. The next few hours had passed in the usual blur of party time, where minutes stretched and compressed unpredictably, and you lost track of how long you'd been doing anything. Marcus danced. He drank. He talked to strangers who he'd never see again and wouldn't remember tomorrow. He followed David up to the 3rd floor to see the infamous turret room, which turned out to be locked. A handwritten sign taped to the door reading, "Private, do not enter." They'd rattled the handle and made jokes about what might be inside. Probably just the owner's bedroom, or storage, or maybe a really dedicated haunted house setup that wasn't quite ready for guests. Around 1 a.m., the party had reached that tipping point where the energy starts to shift from exhilaration to exhaustion. People were getting sloppy drunk, couples were making out in corners, and the music had transitioned from upbeat dance tracks to slower, more hypnotic rhythms. Marcus had noticed that the crowd seemed thinner, though he couldn't say exactly when people had started leaving. One moment the house had been packed, the next there was room to move, to breathe. He'd gone to the kitchen to refill his drink, thinking he'd have one more beer, and then suggest to Jen that they head out. That was when he'd noticed the first strange thing. Everyone in the kitchen was wearing a mask. Not unusual at a Halloween party, obviously, but what struck him was that no one had taken their mask off. Hours into the party, with the alcohol flowing and the heat from all those bodies making the air thick and humid, and not a single person had pushed their mask up onto their forehead or pulled it off to breathe. They were all still in character, devils and vampires and plague doctors and creatures he couldn't quite identify, and they were all staring at him. Not openly staring, not in a way that would have made him call them out on it, but that peripheral awareness you get when you're being watched. Every time he looked at someone directly, they'd be doing something else, pouring a drink, talking to a friend, examining a pumpkin, but he could feel their attention on him, could sense the weight of their hidden gazes behind the masks. Marcus had poured his beer with hands that were suddenly unsteady, telling himself he was being paranoid, that the alcohol and the late hour and the creepy house story were combining to make him jumpy. But the feeling didn't go away. It intensified. He could feel it crawling up his spine like cold fingers. That primal warning system that had kept his ancestors alive on the African savanna. The one that said predator, danger, run. He'd turned to leave the kitchen, and that was when the music stopped. Not gradually, not fading out or transitioning to a new song, but cutting off mid-beat with a mechanical abruptness that felt wrong. Marcus had expected the normal party response, groans of disappointment, someone yelling at the DJ to fix it, people pulling out their phones to provide temporary music. But instead there was silence, complete, absolute silence. And the party continued. People kept dancing in the living room, their movements still matching a rhythm Marcus couldn't hear. In the dining room, he could see through the doorway a group was still laughing at some joke, their mouths open wide, their bodies shaking with mirth that made no sound. In the kitchen, the masked figures were still talking, their heads nodding, their hands gesturing, but the air carried no voices. Marcus tried to speak. He tried to say, "Can anyone else hear this?" Or, "What's going on?" Or even just, "Hey." But his vocal cords wouldn't cooperate. He could feel his mouth moving, could feel the air passing through his throat, but the sound died before it reached the air. It was as though some invisible barrier had been placed between him and the world, a sheet of soundproof glass that rendered him mute and everyone else silent. Panic clawed at his chest. He pushed through the masked crowd in the kitchen, none of them reacting to his passage, none of them acknowledging his presence at all. He had to find Jen. He had to find his friends. They'd know what was happening. They'd be experiencing this too, this impossible silence, and together they could figure it out. The hallway between the kitchen and the living room seemed longer than it had been earlier in the night. Marcus walked down it, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floor, passing doorways that opened onto rooms he didn't remember seeing before. A library lined with books whose spines were blank, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub filled with black water, a bedroom where someone sat on the edge of the bed, their back to the door, their shoulders shaking as though they were crying, though Marcus heard no sobs. He reached the living room and stopped in the doorway, his heart hammering silently in his chest. The room was packed with dancers, all of them still moving to music that didn't exist, all of them still wearing their masks. But these weren't the same people who'd been here an hour ago. Marcus couldn't say exactly what was different about them, what subtle wrongness had crept into their movements, but he knew with absolute certainty that something had changed. They moved too smoothly and too precisely, like animatronics rather than humans. Their gestures had a rehearsed quality, as though they were actors hitting marks on a stage. And their costumes, had they been this elaborate before, this detailed? The devil he was looking at had horns that appeared to grow from its skull, not glued on but emerging from the bone. The vampire's fangs looked sharp enough to pierce flesh, and when it smiled at its companion, Marcus saw blood on its teeth. He backed away from the living room, his breath coming fast and shallow, his mind scrambling for rational explanations. He was drunker than he thought. Someone had put something in his drink. This was an elaborate prank, a coordinated piece of performance art designed to unsettle guests. But none of those explanations felt right. None of them accounted for the silence, or the wrongness, or the way the air itself felt different now, thicker, harder to breathe, charged with a static electricity that made his hair stand on end. Marcus pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the screen. He'd text Jen. He'd tell her to meet him outside. They'd leave, and once they were out of this house, once they were in the normal world, with normal sounds and normal people, everything would make sense again. But when he opened his messages, he found something that made his blood run cold. His last text exchange with Jen was from 10:37 p.m., right when they'd arrived at the party. She'd sent him a picture of herself and Sarah by the front door, both of them smiling, Sarah throwing up a peace sign. Below that, Marcus had sent back a thumbs-up emoji and "see you inside." There were no texts after that, nothing from the last 3 hours. It was as though his phone had stopped working at 10:37 p.m. and was only now starting again. Except that wasn't quite right, Marcus realized as he scrolled through his phone. Because there was something after 10:37. There were photos, dozens of them, filling his camera roll, all time stamped between 10:40 p.m. and 1:43 a.m. Marcus didn't remember taking any photos at the party. He opened the first one with a sense of dread that had become almost familiar, as though he'd known all along that something like this would be waiting. The photo showed the living room from a high angle, as though taken from the second-floor landing. The party was in full swing, people dancing and drinking, everything normal. Except when Marcus zoomed in, he could see that everyone in the photo was looking at the camera. Not obviously, not in a way that would be noticeable unless you were looking for it, but their faces were all angled just slightly toward the lens. All those masked faces, all those hidden eyes, all looking up at whoever was holding the phone, looking at him. Marcus scrolled to the next photo. This one showed the kitchen taken from the doorway where he was standing now. Same thing, people going about their party business, but all of them subtly oriented toward the camera, toward him. The next photo showed the staircase leading to the second floor. Empty, dark, except for a single light at the top of the stairs. But if you looked carefully, you could see something in the shadows at the turn of the landing. A figure, tall and thin, wearing what might have been a costume or might have been something else. It stood perfectly still, its face, if it had a face, turned toward the camera. Marcus's thumb hovered over the next photo, part of him desperate to know what else was in his camera roll, part of him terrified to look. He scrolled faster, images flashing past. The dining room, the hallway, the bathroom with the black water in the tub, the bedroom with the crying figure, except in the photo the figure had turned around. And Marcus could see that it wore a mask identical to the one he'd bought for tonight's party. The one sitting in a bag in his car because he'd decided at the last minute not to wear it. The photos continued. each one showing a different room, a different angle, and in every single one, something was slightly wrong. People in positions they couldn't naturally hold, shadows that fell in the wrong direction, and in several of them, that tall, thin figure in the background, always watching, always perfectly still. The last photo made Marcus drop his phone. It clattered soundlessly on the floor, the screen cracking. But even through the spiderweb of broken glass, he could see the image clearly. It was a selfie. His face filled the frame, his expression blank and empty, his eyes reflecting the flash like an animal caught in headlights. And standing directly behind him, so close they must have been touching, was the tall, thin figure. Its hands, if they were hands, rested on Marcus's shoulders. Its face, if it had a face, was pressed close to his ear, as though it was whispering something. Marcus spun around, his heart in his throat, expecting to see that figure right behind him. But the hallway was empty. No tall, thin presence, no whispering voice, just the same silent, impossible party continuing around him. He bent to pick up his phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He had to get out. He had to find Jen and get out of this house right now. Whatever was happening here, whatever had happened to him during the hours he couldn't remember, it wasn't over. The silence, the photos, the wrongness that permeated everything, it was building to something. He could feel it the way you can feel a storm coming, that pressure in the air that promises violence. Marcus turned back toward the living room, intending to push through the crowd of dancers and search every room until he found Jen. But something stopped him. The dancers had changed position. They were no longer scattered randomly around the room, no longer moving in individual patterns. They'd formed a circle, all of them facing inward, and in the center of that circle stood someone Marcus recognized. It was Jen, or something wearing Jen's face. She stood perfectly still in the center of the circle of dancers, her costume a simple black cat outfit, torn and disheveled. Her mask, a delicate cat ear headband, sat crooked on her head. She was looking directly at Marcus, and even from across the room, even in the dim, flickering light, he could see that her eyes were wrong. They reflected the light too much, catching and holding it like mirrors, like an animal's eyes, like something that wasn't quite human trying very hard to pass. Marcus started forward, his body moving on instinct even as his mind screamed warnings. That wasn't Jen. Whatever was standing in that circle, wearing her clothes and her face and her crooked headband, it wasn't her. But he had to know. He had to look closer. He had to understand what was happening. The dancers didn't move as he approached. They continued their silent swaying, their masks turned inward toward the Jen thing, none of them acknowledging Marcus as he pushed through their circle. He stopped a few feet from her. From it, close enough to see the details that confirmed what his instincts had been screaming. Her skin was the wrong temperature. He could tell, even without touching her, could see the way the air around her didn't move the way air around a living person moves, disturbed by body heat and breath and the invisible processes of life. Her chest wasn't rising and falling. She wasn't breathing. And her eyes, those terrible reflective eyes, weren't focused on him so much as through him, as though he was transparent, as though she was seeing something behind him that was far more interesting than he could ever be. Marcus reached out to touch her shoulder, some desperate part of him still hoping this was a prank, that she'd laugh and pull off a trick contact lens and explain that the whole night had been an elaborate Halloween game. His fingers were an inch from her shoulder when she spoke. The sound didn't come from her mouth. It came from everywhere at once, from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. A voice that might have been Jen's, but distorted, layered with other voices, other tones, until it was a chorus speaking in unison. "You weren't supposed to notice," the voices said. "You were supposed to keep dancing." Marcus snatched his hand back as though burned. The Jen thing's mouth hadn't moved. Her lips remained parted slightly, her expression blank and empty, but the voices continued, emanating from the house itself. "We've done this 53 times, the voices said. 53 Halloween parties in this house. 53 nights when we open the door and invite them in and let them dance until the music stops. And every time they keep dancing. They don't notice. They don't see. They just keep dancing until sunrise, and then they leave and they remember it as the best party they've ever been to." The dancers around Marcus had stopped swaying. They stood perfectly still now, all their masked faces turned toward him, and he understood with a clarity that cut through his terror that they were all like the Jen thing. All of them puppets, vessels, shells animated by whatever presence filled this house. "But you noticed?" the voices continued, and now there was something like curiosity in their tone. "You heard the silence. You felt the change. So we have to know, how did you know? What made you different?" Marcus wanted to run. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to turn and sprint for the door, to crash through these motionless dancers and claw his way to freedom. But he couldn't move. His legs had stopped obeying him, his muscles locked in place by some force he couldn't see or fight. "Was it the woman?" the voices asked. "The one with the plague doctor mask? She always talks too much, gives away too many details. We've told her to be subtle, but she insists on telling the story, on warning people. She thinks it makes it more fun when they figure it out." The tall, thin figure from the photos stepped out of the shadows behind the Jen thing. Up close, Marcus could see that it wasn't wearing a costume. What he'd thought was fabric was actually its skin. If skin could be that texture, that color, a pale gray that seemed to shift and change in the flickering pumpkin light. It was impossibly tall, at least 7 feet, its proportions all wrong, its limbs too long and jointed in too many places. And its face? Marcus forced his eyes away before his mind could fully process what he was seeing. Some instinct warned him that looking directly at that face would break something in his brain, some fundamental understanding of reality that once shattered could never be repaired. "Don't look away," the voices commanded, and Marcus felt his head being turned back toward the tall, thin figure, his neck moving against his will. "You noticed, you saw. So now you have to understand. You have to see what we are." Marcus tried to close his eyes, but his eyelids wouldn't obey. He tried to look down, to look away, to look anywhere but at that terrible face, but his gaze was locked forward. And as he stared, unable to look away, the face began to change. It cycled through forms, through faces, each one lasting only a second or two before morphing into the next. Marcus saw men and women, old and young, their expressions frozen in various stages of terror and confusion and resignation. He saw faces he recognized from the party, people he'd talked to earlier in the night, people he'd seen dancing in the living room. And he saw faces he recognized from his life, his roommate from college, a teacher from middle school, a woman who'd sat next to him on a bus 3 years ago. All of them trapped in that shifting, changing face, all of them looking out at him through the tall, thin figure's eyes. "We wear them," the voices explained. Almost gentle now, almost kind. Everyone who comes to the party, everyone who dances when the music stops, everyone who doesn't notice, we wear them. Not all at once, not permanently. But on Halloween night, for a few hours, we put them on like costumes and we dance and we remember what it was like to be alive. The figure reached out with one of its 2 long arms and touched the Jen thing's shoulder, the same spot where Marcus had been about to touch. The Jen thing shuddered, and for just a moment, Marcus saw a flash of the real Jen underneath, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream, her hands clawing at an invisible barrier that kept her trapped inside her own body. Then the moment passed, and the blank, empty expression returned. "She's still in there," the voices said. "They're all still in there, watching, feeling, experiencing everything their bodies do while we pilot them. It doesn't hurt them, not really. And when the sun rises and we let them go, they don't remember. They just remember dancing, having fun, living their best Halloween. "Let her go," Marcus whispered, and the sound of his own voice after so much silence was shocking, alien, as though he'd forgotten what he sounded like. The voices laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of bones, like glass breaking in slow motion, like every pleasant sound you'd ever heard, corrupted just enough to become unsettling. "We will," they said. "When the sun rises, everyone goes free. Everyone except you." The tall, thin figure moved closer, its face still cycling through stolen expressions, stolen lives. It reached out with both of its two long arms, moving to embrace Marcus the way you might embrace an old friend. "You noticed," the voices said. "You saw. So you can't be let go. You can't leave here carrying that knowledge, that awareness. You'll stay. You'll become part of the house. And next year, on Halloween night, we'll wear you too. We'll dance in your skin and speak with your voice and experience life through your eyes. Won't that be wonderful? Won't that be better than dying alone in some hospital bed 50 years from now, forgotten and afraid?" Marcus felt the figure's hands, if they were hands, touch his shoulders, the same position as in that last selfie. The touch was cold, so cold it burned, and he felt something starting to pull. A sensation like being turned inside out, like his self was being peeled away from his body layer by layer, and then, impossibly, he heard music. It was faint at first, so quiet he thought he was imagining it. But it grew louder, and with it came other sounds. Voices, laughter, the sound of footsteps on the floor above. Normal party sounds. "Real sounds?" The tall, thin figure jerked back as though it had been shocked. The Jen thing stumbled, catching herself on Marcus's arm with hands that were suddenly warm and alive. All around them the dancers broke formation, their movements becoming natural and human again, their costumes just costumes, their masks just masks. "Marcus?" Jen said, her voice confused and sleepy, as though she'd just woken from a deep sleep. "What happened?" The music cut out and I felt so dizzy for a second. Marcus stared at her normal eyes and her crooked cat ear headband and her torn costume that suddenly just looked like the result of a wild night of dancing. He looked around the living room and saw that the crowd had thinned considerably. Maybe 20 people left, all of them rubbing their eyes and checking their phones and starting to collect their coats and bags. "Party's over." "I guess," someone said, their voice loud in the suddenly normal air. "Damn, I can't believe it's almost 2 a.m. already. Time flies when you're having fun, right?" People laughed and agreed, making plans to meet for brunch the next day, exchanging numbers, helping friends find lost scarves and phones. The house was just a house again, old and creaky, but nothing more sinister than that. The pumpkins were just carved squash with candles inside. The fog was just dry ice. Everything was normal except Marcus could still feel the cold touch on his shoulders, could still see that terrible cycling face when he closed his eyes, could still hear the echo of those voices saying, "Everyone except you." "Marcus?" Jen said again, squeezing his arm. "You okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Marcus heard himself say. "Just tired." "Ready to go home?" They found David and Sarah and Josh near the front door, all of them looking as exhausted and confused as Jen, none of them seeming to remember anything strange about the night. They piled into Josh's car and drove back to campus, the conversation light and shallow, everyone agreeing it had been a great party, even though none of them could quite articulate what had made it so memorable. Marcus didn't mention the silence. He didn't mention the photos on his phone, which had vanished when he checked again, leaving only the pictures from earlier in the evening, normal party shots, nothing sinister. He didn't mention the tall, thin figure or the voices or the feeling of being pulled out of his own body. He told himself it had been a hallucination, a bad reaction to alcohol or stress or the power of suggestion after hearing that ghost story from the plague doctor woman. He told himself this almost successfully for the rest of the night and most of the next day. But then, on the evening of November the 1st, Marcus received a text message from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It showed the living room of the house on Ashwood Street, empty now, the Halloween decoration still in place, but the people gone. The photo was taken from the second-floor landing, the same angle as one of the photos he'd found on his phone. And in the foreground, barely visible in the shadows, was a shape that might have been a costume left behind by a careless partygoer, or might have been something tall and thin waiting. Below the photo, a second text arrived, "See you next year." The second story begins at exactly midnight on October 31st, 2018, when Amanda Foster discovered that all the doors in the warehouse party had locked from the inside. She'd been trying to leave for the past 40 minutes, ever since she'd started feeling dizzy and strange, ever since she'd noticed that none of the other partygoers seemed to have faces she could remember. Every time she looked at someone, really looked, tried to focus on their features and commit them to memory, their face would slide away from her attention like oil on water. She'd remember their costume, their body language, the general impression they made, but the specific details of their face would evaporate the moment she tried to hold on to them. She'd thought it was the drinks. Someone must have put something in the punch, some drug that was making her perception wonky. So she decided to leave, to get some fresh air and clear her head, maybe call an Uber and go home. But when she'd tried to open the metal door that led to the alley behind the warehouse, she'd found it locked. Not just closed, but sealed, as though it had been welded shut. She'd tried the main entrance, same thing. The emergency exits, locked. Even the windows, which should have opened or at least broken if she hit them hard enough, remained stubbornly intact, absorbing her attempts to shatter them like she was punching a wall of rubber. Amanda was trapped, and slowly, horribly, she was beginning to suspect that everyone else at the party knew it. The warehouse was in the industrial district of Portland, Oregon, a sprawling 3-story building that had once manufactured something. Amanda couldn't remember what, though the host had definitely explained when she'd arrived 5 hours ago. The space had been transformed for the Halloween party into a maze of rooms and corridors, each one with a different theme. There was a ballroom with a crashed chandelier and ghostly dancers projected on the walls. There was a laboratory filled with bubbling beakers and jars of preserved specimens that looked too realistic to be fake. There was a garden room where plastic vines had been strung from the ceiling, and motion-activated birds would screech when you walked past. It was elaborate and expensive and disorienting, exactly the kind of immersive experience that attracted young professionals who wanted their Halloween to feel transgressive and special. Amanda had come with co-workers from the marketing firm where she'd started working 3 months ago. It was supposed to be a bonding experience, a chance to get to know each other outside the office. But she'd lost her co-workers within the first hour, the maze-like layout of the warehouse separating them, and she'd spent the rest of the night drifting from room to room alone, trying to enjoy herself but feeling increasingly isolated and uncomfortable. The party had been packed when she'd arrived at 7 p.m., at least 300 people, all in elaborate costumes, the music loud enough to make conversation difficult. But as the hours passed, the crowd had thinned, or so Amanda had thought. Now, as she stood in front of the locked emergency exit at midnight, running her hands over the cold metal and finding no handle, no release mechanism, no way to open it, she realized the crowd hadn't thinned at all. There were still hundreds of people here. She could hear them throughout the warehouse, their laughter and conversations echoing through the corridors. But she hadn't seen anyone leave. Not a single person had walked past her heading for an exit, checking their phone to call a ride, saying goodbye to friends. The party hadn't thinned. She'd just stopped noticing people as the night went on, her attention narrowing to a tunnel that contained only herself, her thoughts, and the growing sense that something was profoundly wrong. Amanda pulled out her phone to call 911. If the doors were really locked, if this was some kind of fire code violation or Psycho's idea of a prank, the police needed to know. But when she unlocked her phone, she found that she had no signal. Not just low bars, 0 bars, no service, no Wi-Fi, nothing. She held the phone up higher, moved to different positions near the door, but the no service indicator remained stubbornly present. She put her phone away and turned back toward the party, steeling herself. Okay. The doors were locked, and she had no signal. That was a problem, but not an unsolvable one. There were hundreds of other people here. Someone else would have noticed the locked doors. Someone else would be trying to figure out what was going on. She just needed to find them, coordinate with them, and together they'd figure out how to get out. Amanda walked back through the corridor toward the ballroom, where most of the partygoers seemed to be congregating. The music was still playing, some deep, thumping electronic track that seemed to have no beginning or end, just an eternal loop of bass and synthesized sounds. The ghostly dancers were still projected on the walls, their movements fluid and mesmerizing. And the people? Amanda stopped in the doorway and forced herself to really look at them, to see them. They were dancing, swaying to the music, their movements synchronized in a way that would have seemed choreographed, except that nobody at a party dances in perfect unison. They moved as one organism, a single mass of bodies all responding to the same invisible signals. And their faces, Amanda concentrated, focusing on one dancer in particular, a woman in a Victorian dress with elaborate corpse makeup. She stared at the woman's face, trying to memorize the features, trying to see what the makeup was obscuring. But it was like trying to focus on a reflection in rippling water. The harder Amanda looked, the more the features seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. She'd think she saw a nose, and then it would be in a slightly different position. She'd identify lips, and then they'd be thinner or fuller than they'd been a second ago. The face was constantly changing, or Amanda's perception of it was constantly changing, or there was something about the faces in this room that couldn't be perceived correctly. Amanda backed out of the ballroom, her heart racing. She needed to find her co-workers. She needed to find someone whose face she knew, whose features she could hold in her memory. If she could just find them, they'd be able to see her, to anchor her in reality, to confirm that she wasn't losing her mind. She pulled out her phone again and opened her contacts, scrolling to Rachel from accounting, who'd been at the party earlier. Amanda hit call even though she had no signal, hoping maybe it would go through anyway. The phone didn't ring. It didn't go to voicemail. It just hung there, in a state of attempting to connect, the seconds ticking by until Amanda gave up and ended the call. She tried texting instead.
Rachel, where are you?
The doors are locked.
Something's wrong. Find me.
The message showed as sending, never quite making it through. Amanda looked up from her phone and found that the corridor had changed. Or she'd gotten turned around. Or something. She was no longer outside the ballroom. She was in a part of the warehouse she didn't recognize, a narrow hallway painted black, lit only by red emergency lights mounted near the ceiling. Doors lined both sides of the hallway, all of them closed. No labels or signs to indicate what was behind them. She must have wandered while looking at her phone, not paying attention to where her feet were taking her. That was the only explanation. Except Amanda was usually very aware of her surroundings, very careful about navigation in unfamiliar places. It was part of her personality, part of how she moved through the world. She didn't just wander, but here she was, in a corridor she'd never seen before, with no memory of how she'd gotten here. Amanda turned around, intending to retrace her steps, but the hallway behind her looked identical to the hallway in front of her. Black walls, red lights, closed doors. She couldn't tell which direction she'd come from. She picked a direction at random and started walking, her footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, the sound sharp and lonely. She passed door after door, all of them closed, all of them identical. She tried a few handles, but they were all locked. She kept walking, and the hallway kept stretching out ahead of her, always the same, always dark and red and empty. It should have ended by now. The warehouse was big, but not infinite. She should have reached a wall or another room or some kind of boundary. But the hallway just continued. Amanda started walking faster, then jogging, then running. Her breath came in sharp gasps. Her vision narrowed. The red emergency light strobed past like a countdown, like a timer marking off the seconds until something terrible happened. She ran until her legs burned and her lungs ached, and still the hallway continued, identical and endless. Doors flashing past on either side, all of them locked, all of them hiding something she didn't want to see. And then, abruptly, the hallway ended. Amanda nearly crashed into the wall, catching herself with her hands on the rough concrete. She stood there panting, her palms scraped from the impact, staring at the wall that had appeared out of nowhere. Behind her, the hallway was gone. She was standing in a small room, maybe 10 feet square, with concrete walls and floor and ceiling.
No door, no windows, no way out.
The red emergency light was here too, mounted in the center of the ceiling, casting everything in that hellish red glow. Amanda turned in a circle, her hands outstretched, searching for a seam or crack or hidden door.
There had to be a way out.
She'd gotten in somehow, even if she couldn't remember doing it. The architecture of this room made no sense. You couldn't build a space with no entrance, but architecture didn't seem to mean much in this warehouse, in this party that wouldn't end. She pressed against the walls, feeling for any give, any weakness, nothing. Solid concrete on all sides. She looked up at the ceiling, wondering if there was an access panel or vent. Just smooth concrete and that terrible red light. Amanda pulled out her phone, more out of habit than hope.
Still no signal.
But the screen illuminated her prison, casting white light that was somehow more disturbing than the red glow from above. In the phone's light, she could see something on the wall she'd missed before. Writing, scratched into the concrete with something sharp.
Letters maybe 2 inches tall, crude but legible. The party never ends. Below that,
in smaller letters, the party never ends. Below that, the party never ends. The phrase repeated down the wall, getting smaller and more frantic, until it was barely legible scratches near the floor.
Someone had written this.
Someone had been trapped in this room before her, had spent who knows how long scratching this message into the concrete. Amanda backed away from the wall, her shoulder blades hitting the opposite wall. She wanted to scream, to call for help, to demand that someone explain what was happening. But some instinct kept her silent, some primal awareness that making noise would draw attention she didn't want. She stood in that red-lit concrete box, holding her useless phone, staring at those words scratched into the wall, and tried to think. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a reason this was happening. Maybe it was an elaborate escape room experience, part of the party's theme. Maybe the hosts had planned this, had designed this to scare people, and she was supposed to solve a puzzle or find a clue or something. But the scratches on the wall were too real, too desperate. Too much like the work of someone who'd been genuinely trapped, genuinely terrified, genuinely trying to leave some kind of warning for whoever came after. Amanda closed her eyes and tried to remember earlier in the night, before things had gotten strange. She'd arrived at 7. She remembered parking in the lot across the street, remembered the walk to the warehouse entrance, remembered showing her ticket at the door. She'd been with Rachel and 2 other co-workers, Marcus and Jennifer. They'd gotten drinks from the bar, some kind of Halloween-themed cocktail served in beakers. They'd explored the different rooms, laughing at the effects, taking selfies with the props. Everything had been normal.
Everything had been fun. When had it changed?
When had normal become wrong? Amanda opened her eyes and found that the room had changed. She wasn't in the concrete box anymore. She was standing in the garden room, the one with the plastic vines and the motion-activated birds. Except the vines looked more realistic now, more organic. And when she reached out to touch one, it felt warm and slightly damp, like real plant matter. She yanked her hand back and looked around. The garden room was empty of people, but full of sounds, rustling leaves, bird calls, water dripping somewhere nearby. The sounds were too loud, too close, as though they were coming from inside her head rather than from the speakers mounted in the corners. "Hello?" Amanda called out, her voice small and uncertain.
Is anyone here?
The sound stopped. Complete, absolute silence, so sudden it was like a physical blow. Amanda's ears rang with the absence of sound. She could hear her own heartbeat, her own breathing, the rustle of her costume. She'd dressed as a forest witch, layers of green and brown fabric, flowers woven into her hair, but nothing else. The party sounds that had been a constant background drone all night were gone, and then softly, so softly, she almost missed it. A voice. Amanda. It came from behind her. Amanda spun around and saw a figure standing in the doorway, backlit by red emergency lighting from the corridor beyond. She couldn't make out details, couldn't see the person's face or costume, but the silhouette was familiar. The height, the build, the way they stood, with their weight on one hip. "Rachel?" Amanda said, hope flooding through her.
Oh my God, Rachel, something's wrong with this place.
"The doors are locked, and I got lost, and there was this room—" "Amanda," the figure said again, and this time Amanda heard what had been wrong with the voice the first time. It was Rachel's voice, yes, but it was also other voices layered underneath, speaking in perfect unison, creating a sound that was technically words but felt wrong, mechanical, like an AI trying to replicate human speech. "You weren't supposed to notice," the Rachel figure said, and it, stepped into the garden room. Now Amanda could see her face, and it was Rachel's face, or at least a version of it. The features were right, same eyes, same nose, same mouth, but the expression was wrong. Too smooth, too controlled, like a mask rather than living tissue. "Notice what?" Amanda whispered, backing away until her shoulders hit the wall of vines. The vines shifted against her back, and she felt them, really felt them, moving on their own, wrapping around her shoulders, her arms, her waist. "That the party never ends," Rachel Thing said, tilting her head in a gesture that was too extreme, too precise, like a bird studying a bug before eating it.
That we keep dancing.
That we keep celebrating. That Halloween night in this warehouse lasts forever, and everyone who comes here joins the celebration. Amanda tried to pull away from the vines, but they'd tightened their grip, holding her in place against the wall. They were warm and slightly sticky, like they were secreting something, and when she looked down, she saw they weren't plastic at all. They were organic, alive, pulsing with some internal rhythm that matched the music she could hear again now, that eternal bass line that never stopped. "Let me go," Amanda said, trying to sound commanding, authoritative, but her voice came out as a plea. "We will," the Rachel Thing said, and now it smiled, and its smile was too wide,
showing too many teeth.
"When you stop noticing, when you accept it, when you start dancing again, then you'll be free.
You'll be one of us.
You'll be part of the party that never ends." Other figures appeared in the doorway behind Rachel, Marcus and Jennifer, all things wearing their faces. And behind them more people, dozens of them, all wearing faces Amanda had seen throughout the night, all of them smiling that too wide smile, all of them swaying slightly to music she could barely hear. "Dance with us."
"Amanda," they said in unison, their voices layered and wrong.
"Keep dancing. The party never ends." The party never ends. The vines pulled Amanda away from the wall, repositioning her in the center of the room, holding her upright but not letting her move freely. The figures filed into the garden room, forming a circle around her, all of them swaying to that eternal bass line. They reached out their hands toward her, gesturing for her to join them, to move with them, to surrender to the rhythm. Amanda closed her eyes. If she couldn't see them, if she couldn't see their wrong faces and their wrong movements, maybe she could think. Maybe she could figure out how to escape. But, with her eyes closed, the music became louder, more insistent, and she could feel it trying to take control of her body, trying to move her limbs in time with the bass. She opened her eyes and forced herself to look at the figures surrounding her. Really look the way she'd been unable to earlier. She focused on Rachel's face, the Rachel Thing's face, and instead of trying to remember the features or define them, She looked for what was underneath, for what was using Rachel as a costume, and there, just for a moment, she saw it. Something vast and incomprehensible, something that existed in too many dimensions for her brain to fully process. It was made of darkness and music and motion and time, and it had been here long before this warehouse was built, long before Portland existed, long before humans had names for the season, when the boundary between worlds grew thin. It wore people the way people wore costumes. It danced in their bodies on Halloween night, extending the celebration forever, keeping the boundary open, maintaining its connection to the world of the living. And most people never noticed, because they were too drunk, or too distracted, or too swept up in the fun to realize that they'd stopped being themselves and started being puppets. But Amanda had noticed. And that made her dangerous. That made her something that needed to be incorporated completely, broken down and remade as part of the eternal party. Or else she might remember. She might leave and tell others. She might ruin everything.
"I'll dance," Amanda heard herself say, though she hadn't consciously decided to speak. The figures stopped swaying.
They all turned their attention to her, their wrong faces hopeful and eager. "I'll dance," Amanda said again, and this time she meant it. "I'll join you.
"I'll be part of the party."
Just let me go and I'll dance." The vines loosened their grip, slithering back toward the walls like snakes returning to their den. Amanda stood free in the center of the circle, the figures watching her expectantly. The music swelled, that eternal bass line building, to something almost melodic, almost beautiful. Amanda began to move. Slowly at first, just a slight swaying, letting her body feel the rhythm. The figures around her smiled their two wide smiles and began to dance with her, matching her movements, incorporating her into their synchronized mass. Amanda kept dancing, let herself sink deeper into the music, let it fill her head and push out conscious thought. And while she danced, while the creatures wearing her friends' faces celebrated their successful capture of another dancer for their eternal party, Amanda's hand crept into her pocket and pulled out her phone.
Still no signal.
Still no way to call for help. But the camera worked. The camera didn't need a signal. She held the phone low, keeping it mostly hidden in the folds of her costume, and she started recording. The screen was angled down, pointing at the floor, but the microphone would pick up the music, the sounds, the voices. And if she could just keep dancing long enough to get the phone back in her pocket, if she could keep them distracted while it recorded, then even if she didn't make it out, even if she became one of them, there would be evidence. There would be proof. Amanda danced. She moved with the creatures, let them think she was surrendering, let them believe they'd won. The music swelled around her, and she could feel it trying to burrow into her brain, trying to take root and grow and transform her into something like them. She resisted, held on to herself, held on to her name and her memories and her identity, even as she felt them starting to slip away. She danced for what felt like hours, though time had lost meaning in this place. The figures around her never tired, never slowed, just kept moving in perfect unison to music that never ended. Amanda's legs burned. Her feet ached, her vision blurred with exhaustion. But she kept dancing, kept her phone recording, kept her mind focused on one thought: survive. And then, just when she thought she couldn't dance another second, when she was certain her legs would give out and she'd collapse and become fully theirs, she heard something new. A sound from outside the circle, outside the room, outside the warehouse itself. Sirens. The figures froze. Their two wide smiles faltered. The music stuttered, skipped, repeated a bar like a scratched CD. Someone had called the police. Someone had noticed that people weren't leaving the warehouse. Or maybe a neighbor had complained about the noise. Or maybe Amanda's co-workers who'd left early had gotten worried when she didn't respond to their texts. Whatever the reason, the sirens were getting closer, and the creatures knew it. Amanda could see it in their wrong faces, could see the calculation happening, the decision being made. They could keep everyone here, keep the party going forever, but that would draw too much attention. Or they could let everyone go and try again next year. The music stopped. The real silence this time, not the manufactured silence from before. And with the silence came awareness, people blinking and looking around confused, checking their phones and seeing how late it was, starting to murmur and move toward the exits. The doors were unlocked now. Amanda could see it in the way people were flowing toward them. No resistance, no barriers. The warehouse was releasing its captives, but when Amanda tried to move toward the nearest exit, she found she couldn't. The vines had wrapped around her ankles while she'd been dancing, so subtly she hadn't noticed. They held her in place, kept her from leaving with the others. "You're staying?" the Rachel thing whispered, its voice back to normal, or close enough that nobody else would notice anything wrong.
You saw too much. You know too much.
"You're ours now." Amanda looked down at her phone, still recording, still documenting everything. She made a decision. She threw the phone as hard as she could, sending it skittering across the floor to where a group of partygoers were heading toward the exit. One of them, a guy in a zombie costume, picked it up, looked at it confused, then pocketed it, probably planning to try to find its owner later or turn it into lost and found. The Rachel thing lunged for the phone, but it was too late. The zombie guy was already leaving, pushing through the crowd, disappearing into the normal world with Amanda's phone and its recording of the impossible party that never ended. "You'll still stay," the Rachel thing said, turning back to Amanda with rage in its wrong face. "You'll still be ours." "Maybe," Amanda said, feeling the vines tighten around her ankles, feeling herself being pulled back toward the wall. "But they'll know. They'll see what I recorded. They'll understand." The warehouse was empty now, except for Amanda and the figures surrounding her. The sirens had stopped outside. The police must have been satisfied that everything was fine, just a normal party breaking up at a normal time. The dawn was starting to lighten the sky outside the windows, that grey pre-sunrise light that made everything look washed out and unreal. And as the light grew stronger, the figures began to fade. Not disappear exactly, but become less solid, less present. The Rachel thing's grip on Amanda's arm loosened and then released entirely. The vines around her ankles withered and fell away. The creatures that had worn her friends' faces retreated into shadows that were growing smaller as the sun rose. "Next year," they whispered, their voices fading. "Next Halloween, the party never ends. We'll be waiting. We'll wear you then." And then they were gone. And Amanda was alone in an empty warehouse lit by grey dawn light, her costume torn and dirty, her feet bleeding from hours of dancing. Her phone gone, but its recording hopefully safe with the zombie guy who'd picked it up. She walked to the nearest exit on shaking legs. The door opened easily, swinging out into the morning air. She stepped out into the alley behind the warehouse and breathed in the cold October. No, November now. November morning. She was free. She'd survived. But as she walked toward the street, toward the promise of normal life and coffee shops and people who didn't wear wrong faces, she heard something that made her stop. Music. Very faint, barely audible, but unmistakable.
That same bass line?
That same eternal rhythm, coming from somewhere inside the warehouse, still playing,
Still waiting.
still calling for dancers to join the party that never ends. Amanda ran. She didn't stop running until she was 10 blocks away, until she was in a 24-hour diner full of normal people eating normal food, until she was surrounded by so much noise and life and humanity that she could barely hear the music anymore. She never got her phone back. The zombie guy never turned it into any lost and found, never posted about it online, never tried to find its owner. The recording, if it survived, if it showed anything, disappeared into whatever digital nowhere lost things go. Amanda never went to another Halloween party. She never went out on October 31st at all. She stayed home with the doors locked and the lights off, waiting for November 1st, waiting to be safe again. And every year, on Halloween night, she receives an invitation in the mail. No return address, no stamp. Just a black envelope with her name written in silver ink, and inside a single card that reads, "You're invited to the party that never ends. We're saving you a place on the dance floor. We'll see you when you're ready to come home." Amanda burns the invitations every year, but she knows that eventually one year she'll be too old or too tired or too weak to resist. One year she'll open that black envelope and the invitation will be too tempting to refuse. One year she'll put on a costume and drive to that warehouse in the industrial district, and this time when she starts dancing, she won't stop. She won't notice. She'll become part of the party that never ends, but not yet.
Not this year.
This year, she's still strong enough to burn the invitation, to lock her doors, to wait for November 1st in safety. This year. The third story begins at 3:33 a.m. on Halloween night, 2022, when 6 college students realized they were the only ones left at the Halloween party in the abandoned amusement park, and all the ride operators were still wearing their masks. The masks, they'd been told by the party organizers, were just very realistic costumes. The masks that covered faces that never blinked, that moved in ways skin shouldn't move, that watched the remaining students with an attention that felt less like human observation and more like predators studying prey. The 6 students, Tyler, Madison, Chloe, Aiden, Zoe, and James, stood in a cluster near the rusty carousel at the center of the abandoned lakeside park, their breath misting in the cold air, their costumes looking suddenly foolish and inadequate in the pre-dawn darkness. Around them, the rides stood silent and still, the Ferris wheel, the tilt-a-whirl, the fun house, all of them dark and motionless. But the operators stood at their posts, one at each ride, perfectly still, their masked faces turned toward the group of students. "Where did everyone go?" Madison asked, her voice small and frightened.
There were like 200 people here an hour ago. Tyler pulled out his phone to check the time and saw something that made his stomach drop.
The battery was at 2%. He was certain, absolutely certain, that it had been at 67% when he'd last checked, maybe 20 minutes ago. He'd been taking photos, documenting the night, planning to post them on social media. He opened his Photos app and found hundreds of images he didn't remember taking, all of them time-stamped between 2 and 3 a.m., all of them showing the same thing, the masked ride operators, standing in various positions around the park, always in the background, always watching whoever was in the foreground. "We need to leave," Tyler said, his voice urgent. "Right now. We need to get to the cars and drive away." But when they tried to find the exit, the same gap in the chain-link fence they'd all climbed through 5 hours ago, they discovered it was gone. Not closed or blocked, but gone entirely, the fence continuous and unbroken all the way around the perimeter of the park. The same fence that had definitely, certainly, absolutely had an opening large enough for people to climb through. They walked the perimeter together, staying close, checking every section of fence, but found no exit. The park was enclosed completely, and though they could see the road beyond the fence, could see streetlights and the distant glow of the city, they couldn't reach it. "This doesn't make sense," Aiden said, rattling the fence in frustration. "We got in. There has to be a way out." One of the ride operators moved. Just a small movement, a slight turning of the head, but all 6 students saw it and fell silent. The operator stood at the entrance to the funhouse, its mask, or face, a grotesque clown with a smile too wide and eyes too large. It raised one arm slowly, precisely, and pointed toward the funhouse entrance. "I think it wants us to go in there," Chloe whispered. "I think we should do the opposite of whatever it wants," James replied. But as they watched, the other operators began to move too, all of them raising their arms in perfect synchronization, all of them pointing toward the funhouse.
An invitation.
Or a command. Tyler looked at his phone again. Battery at 1%. He opened the camera and took one more photo of the operators, all pointing, all wearing those terrible masks. He wanted documentation. He wanted evidence that this had happened, that they hadn't all shared the same nightmare. The photo showed what he expected, the operators, the pointing arms, the two still bodies. But when he zoomed in on the clown operator's mask, he saw something that made his hands shake. The mask wasn't a mask. There was no seam, no edge where fabric met skin. The exaggerated features, the wide smile, the bulging eyes, the bright red nose were the operator's actual face. The phone died, screen going black, and Tyler was left standing in the dark with 5 friends and 6 creatures that wanted them to enter the funhouse. They had 2 choices: refuse and see what the operators did, or obey and hope there was an exit on the other side of the funhouse. Both options were terrible. Both options felt like a trap. Together, Madison said, grabbing Tyler's hand. We go in together, we stay together, and we go straight through.
Don't stop, don't look at anything, just get to the other side. They walked toward the fun house, moving as a group, shoulders touching, hands gripping hands.
The clown operator stepped aside as they approached, its movements smooth and inhuman, like a mannequin on rails. Up close, Tyler could smell it, or rather, he could smell nothing at all, no sweat or cologne, or the indefinable scent that living things carry. Just nothing. An absence where a smell should be. The fun house entrance was a clown's mouth. You had to walk between the teeth to enter. In daylight, with the park operational, it probably looked tacky and fun. In the pre-dawn darkness, with 6 creatures watching and no other humans in sight, it looked like exactly what it was, a throat. Waiting to swallow them, they entered inside. The fun house was a maze of mirrors and distorted passages. Everything designed to disorient and confuse. But the mirrors showed more than just reflections. Tyler saw himself repeated infinitely, but in each reflection he looked slightly different. Older in some, younger in others, wearing different clothes, different expressions. In one mirror he looked terrified, in another angry, in another he was smiling that same too wide smile the operators wore. "Don't look," Madison said, pulling him forward. "Just keep moving." They navigated the maze by feel, hands on walls, following the path that seemed most direct. But the fun house kept shifting, passages appearing where there hadn't been passages, dead ends opening into new corridors. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. They might have been walking for minutes or hours. Tyler couldn't tell. And then they heard it. Music, carnival music, tinny and distorted, playing from speakers they couldn't see. And underneath the music, voices. Children's voices laughing and shouting, having the time of their lives. "The park's been closed for 15 years, Zoe said, her voice shaking. "Why do I hear children?" They kept walking, and the voices grew louder, more distinct. Tyler could make out individual words now, excited exclamations about rides and games and cotton candy. Happy sounds.
Normal sounds.
Except they were coming from an abandoned amusement park in the middle of the night from speakers that shouldn't have. Power. The corridor opened into a central room filled with distorting mirrors. Some made you look tall, some short, some fat, some thin. And in the center of the room stood all 6 of them, perfect copies, watching the originals with expressionless faces. Tyler's copy spoke first. "You should have left when you had the chance." The other copies nodded in agreement, their movements synchronized. "The park is hungry," Madison's copy said. "It's been hungry for 15 years.
Ever since they closed it. Ever since they stopped feeding it. Feeding it what?
Aidan asked, though Tyler suspected they all knew the answer. "Happiness," the copies said in unison. "Joy, the energy of people having fun, making memories, feeling alive. An amusement park is a place of power, a thin place where emotions run strong and boundaries grow weak. And this park, Lakeside Park, it learned to eat that energy. It learned to store it, to survive on it. But when they closed it, when the people stopped coming, it began to starve. So it invited us back," Chloe's copy continued. "It found people to organize parties, to spread invitations, to fill the park with young people full of energy and life. And on Halloween night, when the boundary is thinnest, it feeds. It takes what it needs and sends people home with no memories of what they gave up, just a vague sense of having had a wonderful time. Most people, Tyler's copy added, looking directly at him. Most people never notice. They dance and they ride the rides and they drink and they laugh, and when the night is over they go home happy and exhausted, and they never realize they left something behind. They never notice that their joy tastes a little different after that night, a little duller, like they're experiencing it through a filter. The 6 copies stepped forward, moving in perfect synchronization with each other but not with their originals. They reached out their hands, palms up, offering and demanding simultaneously. "But you noticed," they said together. "You 6, you saw the operators. You recognized that something was wrong, so you can't leave like the others did. You have to pay a different price. You have to understand what you're part of now." Tyler felt something pulling at him, a force he couldn't see but could absolutely feel, like hooks in his chest, reeling him toward his copy. Around him, his friends were experiencing the same thing, all of them being drawn toward their duplicates, their bodies moving against their will. "Fight it," James said through gritted teeth. But Tyler could see him taking steps toward his copy, could see all of them losing the battle against whatever power the park held over them. Tyler's copy smiled, not the too wide smile of the operators, but something softer, sadder.
"It doesn't hurt," it said.
"And you'll still be you mostly. You'll just be you and us, mixed together, part of the park forever. You'll work the rides on Halloween night.
"You'll wear the masks."
You'll help feed the park so it can survive another year."
"Isn't that better than dying? Isn't that better than fading away into nothing?" "No," Tyler said. But even as he said it, he was taking another step toward his copy, his hand reaching out to meet its upraised palm, and then Madison screamed.
Not a scream of fear, but of rage, raw and primal. She grabbed one of the distorting mirrors, a cheap thing made of polished metal bolted to a frame, and ripped it off the wall with strength that shouldn't have been possible. She swung it like a weapon, smashing it into her copy's face. The copy shattered like glass, fragments exploding outward, each piece reflecting a different version of Madison before dissolving into nothing. The pulling sensation stopped. The other copies stepped back, their faces showing something that might have been surprise. "The mirrors," Madison said, breathing hard. "They're what's keeping the copies solid. They're what's giving the park power over us."
"Break them!"
They moved as one, all 6 of them grabbing mirrors and smashing them, ripping them off walls, throwing them to the ground. The copies screamed, a sound that wasn't human, wasn't anything that should come from a throat, and began to dissolve. The carnival music cut off mid-note. The children's laughter stopped. The funhouse began to shake, mirrors cracking spontaneously, walls tilting at angles that defied gravity. Tyler ran, his friends beside him, all of them sprinting through passages that were collapsing behind them. They burst out of the funhouse's exit and into the park proper, where dawn was fully breaking now, pink and gold lights spilling over the abandoned rides. The operators were gone. The fence, when they reached it, had an opening large enough to climb through. They scrambled through one by one, not stopping to question or analyze, just desperate to be on the other side in the normal world.
In safety, they ran to their cars and drove away without speaking.
Each of them alone with their thoughts, alone with what they'd experienced. They didn't stop driving until they were back on campus, back in daylight, back in the world of classes and assignments and ordinary concerns. Tyler checked his phone once it charged, looking at those photos he'd taken. They were still there, the hundreds of images of masked operators. But when he looked closely, when he really studied them, he realized something. In every single photo, the operators were closer to the camera than they'd been in the previous image. Slowly, methodically, frame by frame, they'd been approaching whoever was taking the photos. Approaching him, while he'd been so focused on documentation that he hadn't noticed he was being hunted. He deleted the photos. He deleted everything from that night. He wanted no record, no reminder, no connection to Lakeside Park. But 3 months later, on a grey February morning, Tyler received a package, no return address. Inside was a Polaroid photograph of the 6 of them standing in front of the fun house, all smiling, all happy, all wearing the operator's masks. On the back, in handwriting that looked like it was written by 6 different people simultaneously, a message, "Thank you for feeding the park. We'll see you next Halloween." "The rides miss you already," Tyler burned the photograph. But he knows it doesn't matter. He can feel it now, always. A connection to that place, a thin thread that runs from his chest to somewhere in the abandoned amusement park. On Halloween nights it pulls at him, calls to him, promising that if he comes back, if he puts on the mask, if he works the rides and feeds the park,
he'll finally understand what he's become. Part of him wants to go.
Part of him wants to surrender to that pull, to stop fighting and just accept what happened that night. Part of him thinks maybe his copy was right. Maybe it's better to be part of something forever than to fade away into nothing. But not yet.
Not this year.
This year he's still human enough to resist. This year, 3 stories, 3 Halloween parties, 3 encounters with something that shouldn't exist but does, that waits in houses and warehouses and abandoned parks for the night when the boundary grows thin and people come looking for a good time. The parties all ended. The music stopped. The guests went home. But for Marcus and Amanda and Tyler, for everyone who noticed what they weren't supposed to notice, the parties never really stopped. They're still going somewhere, in some space adjacent to reality, and every Halloween night the invitations arrive and the pull grows stronger, and the distance between the normal world and the party that never ends grows thinner. They're still out there, all of them trying to live normal lives and ignore the music they can still hear sometimes when it's very quiet and very late. Trying to forget the faces that weren't quite faces, the voices that weren't quite voices, the feeling of being worn like a costume by something vast and incomprehensible. But forgetting is hard when every October 31st brings a new invitation. When every Halloween night the phone rings from blocked numbers, or envelopes arrive with no stamps, or they wake from dreams of dancing to find mud on their shoes and scratches on their skin from places they never remember visiting. The parties are still going. The music is still playing, and somewhere, in houses and warehouses and abandoned parks, the hosts are waiting for their guests to come home, to come back where they belong, to finally stop resisting and start dancing again, because the party never ends. It never ends. It never ends.